Next, we'll transition to the second plenary presentation for today, which is focused on an issue of really high importance to ICDA as an international community, which is ethical considerations for international collaborative research. This session will be moderated by Carolyn Hutter, who is the Division Director for the Division of Genome Sciences at the National Human Genome Research Institute, as well as an active member of ICDA's organizing committee and chair of ICDA's Policy and Ethics Working Group. Carolyn, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. I'd just like to say I'm really honored today to be able to introduce Michael Parker, a professor of bioethics at the University of Oxford. He's also director of the ESOC Center and the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanity at the Oxford Big Data Institute. I really can't think of a better person to come in and talk to us today about his topic around ethical considerations for international collaborative research. He has a number of experiences, including recently chairing a Council on Bioethics working group on the ethical aspects of research in global health emergencies, certainly a topical item, as well as being a member of the UK Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies and the World Health Organization Ethics in COVID working group. He also has been involved in establishing a global health bioethics network along with partners in Africa and Southeast Asia, and chairs the Ethics Advisory Committee of Genomics England. So again, today he's going to be talking to us about ethical considerations for international collaborative research. Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. Thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion. I'm very much enjoyed the paper so far. I guess the reason I'm here is and asked to talk about this topic is really because building international collaborations is so core to the success of ICDA and an ethical. And what I want to do is talk about some of the ethical considerations that are going to be part of that journey. I think to begin with, it's probably quite good in this context to say something about the way I understand the relationship between ethics and science, because many of the people in the room will have had experience of ethics, which is largely or perhaps even exclusively about governance, regulation, about the kinds of things you have to do in order to get on with the stuff that you really want to get on with. And I don't start thinking about it that way. So for me, my starting point is that I see the products of the kind of research collaborations that we're trying to promote here as a global common good. And we should be, there are strong ethical arguments in favor of medical research and in favor of doing the kind of things that you're doing. The other thing that I think is very important is and this doesn't happen as often as it should, is the importance of taking seriously both the ethics of doing stuff but also the ethics of not doing stuff. And we don't, I think, pay sufficient attention to the ethics of not doing scientific research and certain types of scientific research. So what I'm in favor of is a kind of a balanced approach to that, and also seeing medical research as ethically important. And of course, nonetheless, it's important for us to avoid unethical research practices. And I'm not saying that's not important, but my priority here is a more constructive one, I think. And my view is that bioethics should be seen and understood as a critical friend to science. So someone who can help you achieve the kind of things that you want to achieve. And in the context of that discussion and this presentation, I suppose, in some ways, if I wanted you to remember one slide most of all, it would be this one. That just to let you know that the ICDA does have a policy and ethics working group that you can come to and that will hopefully provide important guidance for the alliance as a whole. The group has two chairs, so co-chairs Carolyn, who you've just met, and Mam Zawati are the co-chairs of the group. It's a cross-cutting advisory group which adopts a proactive approach to ethics, so trying to identify ethical issues and do work on them that can be useful and important to the alliance. And looking at the international context of ICDA in particular, looking, for example, at data sharing and ways of promoting open science. And there are a couple of things that we're currently working on particularly, and one of those is issues to do with polygenic risk scores, and the other is modes of stakeholder engagement. And also just wanted to remind you or let you know that we are seeking to expand our international membership. So if you have ideas or recommendations for people you think should be on this group, then it'd be great if you could send your recommendations to this email address. And I will actually have that on a slide at the end if you don't get it now. Now, one of the things that many of you will have heard of these kind of ethical issues on this slide, and these are some of the things that I think are very important, but I'm not going to be talking about them today. So when you think about research ethics, you might think about a discipline that looks at, well, what are the acceptable levels of risk for research participants? And what should be the structure of independent ethical review? What are the ethical issues of different kinds of trial research designs and so on? But I'm not going to focus on those. I could give a talk on all of them, and it'd be interesting to talk about them. But my focus today is on the idea of collaborations, so the ethical issues arising in collaborations. And one reason for that is that, as I said at the beginning, data-driven research at scale, the kind of things that ICDA is trying to promote, are a common good and something we should value, but that presents a number of ethical issues. And the key roles of collaboration and data sharing in this are particularly important. And one of the ways of thinking about scientific success in this area is to think of it as what's sometimes called a collective action problem. These are the kind of problems that can't be solved by one person or one group or one country on their own. That are kind of problems that require collaboration between people who might have different interests from each other. So climate change would be a good example. And one of the problems in this context for groups like, the kind of work we're interested in, is the underrepresentation of different populations, and that's a problem. So that's important for a number of reasons. So one reason is groups around the world, anyone who's interested should be included in global science, because I've said it's a global common good. Another reason is that the tools that are developed by data-driven science can only be of value to populations if those populations or members of those populations are included in the analysis. And similarly, if the tools don't work with populations, then that's going to raise questions about their access to services. So there are a whole range of reasons for wanting to focus on collaboration and think about why it's important. And I wanted to pay particular attention to this idea of inclusiveness and diversity. And maybe one of the places to start will be to ask the question: what's a fair collaboration? Because perceptions that collaboration is unfair is a real impediment to people joining, or scientists around the world joining collaborations. So it's important to think about what makes a collaboration a good one or an unfair one. And there's been a lot of international attention being paid to this issue in the ethics world, in the regulatory world, but also in science. An organization called Carolyn has produced a number of reports on this and highlighting ways in which fairer collaborations can be developed and some of the problems that people face. As you will know, there have been a number of quantitative studies of authorship imbalances, so studies done in low and middle income countries where nevertheless the authorship, the lead authorship, senior authorship, and perhaps in some cases all of the authorship comes from high income countries. These are sort of increasing interest. There's increasing attention being paid to those issues. There's also increasing attention, particularly in questions relating to data sharing, of the importance of not undermining scientific capacity in low and middle income by the shipping internationally, and that being analysed very quickly in ways that middle income countries may find hard to keep up with. So how can we, on the one hand, promote international science, and on the other hand, maintain and build the scientific capacity that's needed to make that successful all around the world? So one of the questions then is, we might want to ask, is what counts as a good collaboration from the actual scientist's perspective? And interestingly, a few years ago, together with Patricia Gingori, I did a series of interviews with mainly African scientists, but also scientists in South Asia, so India, Sri Lanka, and also Southeast Asia, and asked them, what for you makes a difference between joining a collaboration and not joining one? And these are the 8 things that they highlighted as most important, emerged as most important there. So some of them were to do with competence, the effective leadership and so on of the initiative. Some of them were to do with fairness and trust, which I'll come back to later. But interestingly, the most important one for everyone, literally everyone we interviewed, was this need to be actively involved in interesting science, which is perhaps counterintuitive. So here's an illustrative quote from a researcher, very senior researcher in East Africa. One of the things that kind of makes me feel a bit uncomfortable about joining these big collaborations is when you feel that collaborations are really about getting access to samples and data without really having any kind of contribution. And I think that's something that I'd be very wary about, where I feel am I really going to contribute anything, intellectually? So this idea of intellectual contribution to science being very, very important. And strikingly, these are crucial. Addressing these issues is crucial for the success of collaborations. But striking to me was after doing this work was I started to think about some of the initiatives that I've been involved in that weren't in low middle income countries, and two of them here were Deciphering Developmental Disorders Project and Genomics England in the UK. And it's striking to me how similar those concerns are. You're looking at collaborations between partners in high income countries as well as in low income countries. So these concerns about fair collaboration are really important to people and make a big difference when it comes to success of these collaborations. And one of the things that's important there is this idea of trust and fairness. And that's particularly important when it comes to sharing data. So a key component in the success of the collaborations we're talking about is the willingness not only to join the collaboration, but also to share data. But that's actually perceived by many researchers, not only, as I say, low and middle income countries, but elsewhere, as being a risky activity. And one of the reasons it's risky for people is it starts to look like the cutting edge of science can look like it's somewhere far away, and that can be a threat. And there are a number of other threats which I'll come to. And I was involved in a 5-country study not so long ago, which interviewed researchers, research committee members, ethics committee members, and members of communities. What we found was that the value of data sharing, once it was explained to people, was recognized and valued. This was seen as an important thing. But for it to be successful and to be appropriate and to be accepted, the risks really needed to be minimized. And then again, this issue of fairness and reciprocity in collaborations was really seen as very important, as were trust, capacity building, and appropriate consent. And I'll come to consent in a moment. One of the issues that's quite interesting here, and I think in the context of international data sharing, is this idea about what some people refer to as moral distance. So one of the worries that researchers and ethics committees have is what's going to happen to their data and samples when they leave the country. So the idea that people in other places may not be as sensitive to the impacts of the uses of those data on communities and populations as researchers who are local. And that has a number of different worries. So one worry might be that the data are used for things that wouldn't have been approved locally. Another worry is that the potential for population level harms and stigma, even where the data are anonymized, the potential for an impact on populations. And a third worry was about the potential for exploitation and the lack of benefit sharing as a result of this research. So nothing comes back to us. And then finally, a kind of version of that is this idea that the data disappear, and with it, there's a neglect of the research priorities of the global south. The research that's done on that data is research that's relevant to the north rather than to the south. Now, one way of thinking about protection in research ethics is often to focus on the importance of consent. If you've got consent and that's properly informed, then that gives you the protections you need. People know what they're signing up to. But the problem is if you're creating the kind of bioresources that we're talking about here, so either big data sets or sample and data sets, is that the consent it necessarily has to be broad. It has to be broad. It can't be that specific because we don't yet know what research is going to be done on those samples and that data. And that, of course, creates problems of trust and confidence again, and it brings us back to these issues. So there's a question about whether broad consent is going to be acceptable in these kind of settings and what it needs to be complemented with. I recently did a study with partners in Uganda, Zambia, and Ghana, where, again, community members, researchers, and ethics committees were asked, do they think that broad consent is acceptable? And interestingly, they all thought that it was generally acceptable, but with some caveats. So there needed to be effective governance of the uses of the data that were sensitive, or at least capable of being sensitive to local concerns. Very strong view that communities or nations should get some kind of feedback about research progress. So that's not feedback about individual data or anything, but feedback about the progress of the initiative. And that there ought to be some kind of local support for participants during and after the study, and that may well be a more local responsibility than the responsibility of an initiative like ICDA, for example. So this idea that trust and confidence are emerging here is extremely important, I think. And sustainable research of the kind we're interested in depends upon not only the existence of trust and confidence, but the idea that that's actually well-founded. People have good reasons to trust. And ethics committees can place their trust with confidence. And what this suggests is that community engagement at the places where research is done and data are gathered is not simply something that's merely nice to have, but it's actually essential to the long-term success of the initiative. And of course, it's important to remember that what counts as relevant to the public interest is going to be different in different places. So different communities, different countries, different people are going to have different views about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And in that context, one of the things that people seem to worry about most, and so that's something that needs engagement around, is the potential commercial partnerships that might be part of research and of data sharing. So there's not necessarily a view that commercial partnerships and commercial uses are wrong. It's just that they need to be explained and understood and justified. So that went through that really reasonably quickly because I want to leave some time for discussion. So a range of reasons why trust and the embedding of ethics are important. And I think one of the things about ethics is that it's important to remember that ethics review itself, so getting ethics approval, is not enough to meet those concerns that I've outlined rather quickly there. They can only really be, those ethical issues don't all resolve prospectively at the time of ethics approval. Many of those will emerge during the course of the research or the subsequent uses of data. And what that means is there's a need to identify and address those issues throughout the life of not only the research project, but also the subsequent uses of data in large-scale collaborations. And this brings me back to my point at the beginning, which is the importance of ethics and science being seen as partners, and the value of embedding ethics into scientific initiatives and data sharing collaborations. And I've stressed in the first bullet point there the importance of that. Ethics should be diverse, so there should be a genuine sense in which the ethics expertise is both expert but also inclusive because of the concerns varying around the world. So I have one more slide after this. I firstly want to bring you back to the beginning to remind you about the ICDA ethics group, to urge you to get in touch with us if you have issues that you're interested in, or if you'd like to recommend people to be a member of our group. And the message I'd like to take away is this idea that ethics can be an enabler of successful scientific collaboration if it's built in from the beginning. And like everyone else, I'd like to acknowledge a few people at the very end. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues on the working group. So Carolyn and Man, I've mentioned earlier, Professor Barthak-Knoppers is also someone who's a key part of this and has supported this work. A number of my collaborators around the world, and then finally the Wellcome Trust, who fund most of my work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So I really, your point about embedded ethics really resonated with me, and it's something that we definitely think about a lot when sort of putting together projects. But I think maybe for people in the audience who haven't thought about that as much, could you talk a little bit more about what does like a successful embedded ethics, what does it look like when that's successful to you? And do you have examples either of things where you think that worked well or didn't work well that could help elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can certainly give examples. That might take up a bit too much time into too much detail, but I'm really happy to give examples and to talk more about them. I think one of the things that's really crucial is that the idea that there is a trusting relationship between the scientists and the ethicists. So the ethics is seen as part of the team, and they're seen as a constructive part of the enterprise. And there are sometimes worries that the ethicists are going to be kind of very negative about science and create hurdles. But I think in a way, a better way of thinking about it would be to think about, like, you might have various people who might propose different statistical methodologies, for example, in the context of a scientific collaboration, or they might suggest different methodologies for thinking about, let's say, the structures that we just heard about in presentations earlier. And in those kind of discussions, you'll have some people, you'll have disagreement, but you'll have constructive disagreement, and a way forward will have to be agreed. And I'd like to see, ethics should be part of that conversation, I think. And when it isn't, when it's involved but not properly involved, sometimes that can be kind of, I don't want to say destructive, but it can be less constructive than it might be. And there are lots of examples of that go, and obviously our involvement here is a great example of that too.
Yeah. And then another thing that I wanted to pull out a little bit more is, sort of talking a little bit about the considerations of the research priorities when you come in for international collaboration. And, you touched on separately, but I think it's interesting to think about how you think about them together, both the sort of needs and interests of the researchers in the low middle income countries, and then what might be the research priorities of the populations or the sort of areas in those. And do you ever notice sort of tension between those, or do you have thoughts from sort of a perspective about how to make sure that both of those sort of areas of consideration could be brought forward?
Yeah, this is really, really, really helpful, and obviously, as in any discipline, all of these terms can be unpacked a lot more.
Right.
I mean, the idea, I suppose, one of the ways in which this is captured in many of the ethics kind of guidelines and literature is the idea of social value. That research should have some relevance, and that's a complicated concept. So one version of that will be just ask the population what they want and give it to them, or the local researchers. Another would be, well, that there is a kind of leadership role for science as well. Just as it would be in Washington or in New York or London, there will be scientists have to take some leadership role in saying, look, this is actually stuff that's valuable. So it's a complicated process, but I do think, so there will be tensions between those different interests. But the way you address those is through funders taking responsibility for, and also researchers, for genuine engagement. And engagement is a two-way process, but it's clear that the expertise lies with the scientists, and there's a leadership role for science in that space. But that's why community engagement and public engagement are so important, I think.
Yeah. And then I think one of the, just super quick, and we are going to have to move on in terms of time, but I think one of the questions that's coming up is a question about how do we consider the hierarchical structure of consortia and the sort of issues, for example, in authorship, when you start having 300 people on a paper, what is meaningful recognition, and how do you sort of think about the opportunity to have real engagement in an international project like this when there is the factor of who's the leadership in the project versus making sure that other participants and members come in and get recognition. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so obviously if we were all in one room together, I'd be asking some of the African scientists in the room, say, what do you think about this? And it would be great to get their views.
Right.
The people that I spoke to recognize the importance of leadership, and they recognize that, someone or some group of people is going to have to run a consortium. They're not naive about that. They just want it to be done fairly, and they want their interests to be taken seriously, and they want to have an opportunity to say when they think something's not right. And they also want to be sure that the leadership roles are not always going to be taken by people from the familiar countries. They want to see more fairness in that role. So it's not an argument against hierarchy, but it's an argument about fairness and the opportunity to genuinely be involved in those kind of debates. And that's one of the things. I mean, that quote that I read out, I could give you hundreds of quotes where people say, look, I just felt like I was being ripped off, not financially, but intellectually. I wasn't being properly included in this process, and that's something that has to change. And I also think that there are responsibility. It's in the long-term interest of the kind of science. Charles Ratimi speaking at the last plenary I came to, is in the interest of success of this kind of science that it is genuinely collaborative in ways that people would see genuinely as fair, because it's not going to work otherwise.
Yeah. So there's some more interesting questions popping up, but we have sort of run out of time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel. But I will note that, especially in terms of these questions, I'm recording these. We'll bring them back to the group. And also to let people know, in addition to sort of joining the group or suggesting memberships, you can also reach out to us as the Ethics and Policy Group if there's key areas that you really would like us to tackle, that if you think about, part of what we want to be doing is embedding into the larger things that ICDA are doing. And one of the ways is that to have that two-way communication, to put us in positions to be proactive to the consortium needs and not just reactive when issues arise. Because as Michael really highlighted, that's what's needed to really have the ethics and the scientific partnerships go together. So on that note, I will send it back over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Carolyn and Michael, for leading such a great discussion. As you say, I think we really hope that ethics can truly be an enabler of international science in the International Common Disease Alliance.